Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be a continuation of a previous lesson from the 9th chapter in the book of Romans. We made it all the way up until the 18th verse. We're going to take it from 19 all the way home to 33. And before we establish the narrative context, we want to lay the doctrinal foundation. We want to speak of what the 9th chapter of Romans speaks of, which is divine sovereignty. The doctrine is best understood, I feel, in light of the knowledge of his attribute of omnipresence. And his omnipresence, he is not only everywhere at once, but every time at once. So before every speck in the universe, which goes whichever ways it goes, every human decision, every animal action is known in advance of him, because he laid the foundation of the earth before, and he is in the beginning before the beginning, and permanently and instantly everywhere at once. So he is able to experience the time-space continuum in one panoramic view instantly and permanently and totally, eternally. So, but the complications which human agency exists within light of divine sovereignty are largely of our own construct. So there is no contradiction or tension between the two. We are at liberty to make moral decisions. We are guided by immoral, amoral, or moral impulses, and that is because of the sovereignty of the one who decrees us able to. So he's able to put us in certain places and situations to unfold his creative story, which was set in motion before the foundation of the earth. Now, the fact that we are far from pawns on a providential puppet screen, because we are not omnipresent. We are finite, and we exist in one time and space, and we don't have all the answers. We're not omniscient, we're not omnipotent. These are the things one needs to be truly sovereign, as opposed to free. We are free to make our own decisions, live our lives as we choose. Because he is a father, and he will not force any of his children to come to him. But we are not absolved of the responsibility for using our agency, and we have to live with the mystery. So the doctrine of predestination, it is scripturally substantiated in one place in the 29th verse of the 8th chapter. Now, there is solid biblical foundation for that doctrine, but I'm not against that. What I am against is claiming the mandate of the predestined for myself, and I would advise anyone else to do the same, because that's borderline blasphemous to claim to know the things which are only known to God. Remember, he is omnipresent and sovereign. We are not. We are at his will, but in his will, he gives us the will that we have to live with in order to chart our way. He knows who's going to get there and who's not going to get there, but we don't. And part of what living by faith is living with the mystery of that. And in the 8th chapter, he closes with a ballad of the inseparable, unbreakable bond of the love of the Messiah, before whom the only force or entity or power that can separate us from him is whoever we let into our lives. But in and of himself it is. But he moves from rejoicing in the Messiah to weeping on behalf of Israel. 2nd verse, that I have great sadness and continual grief in my heart. Paul really cared about the salvific fate of the Jewish people. He was intimately, indeed passionately, invested in their eternal welfare. So why was he crying, and why was he mourning, and why was he lamenting? Because so many of the Jewish people were lost, who are Israelites, who's in the adoption and esteem and the covenants and the giving of the Torah and the worship and the promises. Verse 4, in spite of all these privileges and advantages, the majority of the Israelite people did not make it back to their heavenly homeland. So they were chosen for a purpose. They were adopted. They were the children, the apple of his eye. Now all people are children of Yahweh, but they alone had a relationship with him of all the nations in the earth, and they existed to witness and point the other nations to bring them to him. That is something they failed to do. But the covenants, there are several covenants throughout the Jewish history. There was a Abrahamic covenant, there's a Mosaic covenant, and there's a Davidic covenant. We don't have time to get into each one, but the covenants is pluralized in this verse. And the giving of the Torah, that was the greatest miracle of all. That was their prized possession, the law. The Jews were really, really into the law. And they also had the temple, the tabernacle, and the promises. So before the law or anything else was the dispensation of promise. So Paul takes it all the way back to the patriarchs, the fathers, and that is who the Messiah. Now we read of an affirmation of his divine human duality in the 5th verse, but 6th verse he says, however, it is not as though the word of Yahweh has failed, for they are not all Israel who are of Israel. So the only one to blame and the only one at fault in that situation is Israel. They failed. The word of the Yahweh cannot fail, and they were in fact not all promised. Their prophets wrote, only a remnant shall find the way, and we're going to read that from the prophet Isaiah. So the word of Yahweh had delivered his promises. He declared a day of Yahweh, a day of judgment, day of separation, and a lot of the chosen people, the sheep of his pasture, Israel, were going to be shifted with the goats. And then he goes all the way back to the doctrine of sovereignty and agency with Esau and Jacob. Jacob was the father of the 12 patriarchs of Israel. Yet before they were born or had done any good or evil, in order that the purpose of Elohim according to choice might stand, not of works, but of him who calls, it was said to her, the greater shall serve the lesser, as it has been written, Jacob I have loved, but Esau I have hated. So this was all according to the purpose. They had not been born, but he created them and endowed them with certain characteristics and capacities and knew how each of them would respond in every given situation, and that the machinations between everything that occurred between them would work out into its providential path. And this was promised to the mother Rebekah. They were born twin brothers, but Jacob was clutching the heel of the firstborn, Esau, and his preeminence was decreed to his mother when she was pregnant with these two. And then this is just Malachi 1:3. I think it's a rather unfortunate translation to read hated, because another way of translating the Hebrew original is rejected. But we're not suckers for more palatable or political correct terms. It means what it means, and it means what it doesn't mean. Jacob was the chosen one, Esau was not. For he says to Moses, I shall favor whom I favor, and I shall have compassion on whom I have compassion. Compassion is more familiarly translated as mercy. This is a reference to Exodus 33:19. So what he declared to Moses is as equally true and valid and applicable in every age as since. For the scripture says to Pharaoh, for this same purpose I have raised you up, to show my power in you, and that my name be declared at the earth. So then he favors whom he wants and hardens whom he wants. So this question of hardening whom he wants, now he is not obligated to intervene in the common exchange of human interaction, but some people he does specially favor, and other people he deliberately hardens, such as Pharaoh's, who through the final 5 of the 10 miracles that we read of, the first 5 are written that he hardened his heart, but then it's consistently Yahweh hardened his heart from thenceforth. But he also knows who will harden their own heart. But so with Pharaoh, that was an unusual circumstance, but, he did intervene, but he didn't manipulate or violate his moral agency, and he never does, because for him to do so would compromise his absolute and total sovereignty, as we've explained it. Verse 19, then you shall say to me, why does he still find fault? For who has resisted his counsel? So they're trying to say, who are we to blame if we harden our hearts, if it was known by him and resisted his counsel, his will, what he decrees is what is, and who are we to resist, being the way he made it. But we don't want to get stuck in the permanent, if we're wicked, we don't want to get stuck in the permanent mind state that we are. We want to see the way out, and so we have to find fault in ourselves, because we are responsible for the decisions we make and the agency we elect to follow. But who are you, O man, to talk back to Elohim? Shall that which is formed say to him, that who formed it, why have you made me like this? So Paul, what he's not saying is that it's not okay to take your questions and to talk and to speak, but the way talking back is just defiant and disobedient. So he's not against man talking to God. Paul did that all the time. So does every Christian who's ever been a real Christian. And then this metaphor of the potter and the clay is gonna be formed. So the same way that we are formed, we are created. Who are we to resist? Why have you? What right or reason do we have to question the one who made us? Why he made us? He is sovereign. We are not. We are still given the chance and the potentiality for the positive outcome of making it back to him. But we have no right or reason to question why anything is what it is. Read the book of Job for more on that. Does not the potter have authority over the clay from the same lump to make one vessel for value and another not for value? So the foundation of this symbolism is found in the Old Testament major prophets. Isaiah and Jeremiah both speak of potters in clay, with the same analogy being man to his maker. And the difference between man and clay is that clay has no mind of its own, has no will of its own, is incapable of independent action. It is wholly manipulable and under the control of the hand of the potter. Yet human beings resist and rebel against the one who made us. So we'd be better off if we were more like the clay, just not resisting, not questioning, not defying, not disobeying, than we were if we were ourselves. And if Elohim, willing to show wrath and make his power known, with much patience tolerated the vessels of wrath prepared for destruction. Now, wrath is a last resort, but it is completely righteous, because he is righteous and intrinsically so. So the fact that he hasn't expressed his wrath on all of us prematurely is because he always gives a window of repentance, of which Paul speaks. It is an act of goodness of his in Romans 2:4. The window of repentance. Now, why were his own people, the chosen people, the Hebrew Israelite people, enslaved for 430 years? And the answer was to give the Canaanites a window to repent. Their religious practices were the worst of all. That's one of the reasons their indigenous land was so selected to be the promised land. And, he told Noah, when the imaginations of the human hearts were evil continually, that he would give them a 120-year period early in the 6th chapter of Genesis. Or it grieved his heart. That much is known. Moses communicates that much from Yahweh. And that he might make known the riches of his esteem on vessels of mercy, which he has prepared beforehand for esteem. So just as some works of art are more valuable to the one who made them, so too are some creations. The prize creations are the ones that he elects to salvation, and we are the most beautiful trophies on his display case, if we are being paralleling pottery to but why us? And first off, I want to retreat from saying us, but why some and not others? And this is because he is complete. This ties into the faith that we have on his sovereignty and his justice. So everything that we read about who he is from Genesis to Revelation, that we accept by faith. So if it is written of him that he is sovereign and that he is just, that means we know it's all going to work out. It's going to be beyond a reckoning, and human justice is going to be more than the sum of its own parts in that great and final day. Even whom he called, not only us of the Jews, but also of the Gentiles. So the called is not only Jews, but the Gentiles, and the fact is that the Gentiles are numerically dominant in the kingdom of heaven, even though the Jews, had the advantages and the right relationship. Eventually, we eclipsed them when the path and plan to salvation was made known to them through Jews such as Paul, who instilled in them a faith that transcended the Jewishness with which he was raised. But there is a remnant. There's always a remnant since the 5th chapter of Genesis. This concept of a remnant is the innocent minority, the ones who are spared of the judgment. And we read of Noah was the culmination of the righteous remnant in Genesis 5. As he says in Hosea, I shall call them my people who were not my people, and her beloved who was not beloved. Hosea is speaking in the 2nd chapter of the book which bears his name of the Jewish people, a displaced people, an exiled people, a forsaken people, who will have lost their status as a chosen people in the land that they are displaced. But he's speaking of the Jewish restoration, which would take place most immediately after the exile. But what Paul's speaking of here is he's applying it to Gentiles. They were estranged. They were not his people. They did not know him until the Jews made him known. And of course, the Gentiles are equally beloved. God is no respecter of persons. And it shall be in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, but they shall be called sons of the living Elohim. This is from Hosea 1:10. So you are my people. Now you are not my people is the opposite. That is a claim of ownership. But in spite of them not being his people, he will restore them. Hosea is speaking to the Jews. Paul is applying it to the Gentiles. Hopefully we've communicated that in the way that makes sense. But he dances around the Old Testament. We're going to hear 3 things from Isaiah before this lesson's over. And Isaiah cries out on behalf of Israel, though the number of the children of Israel be as the sand of the sea, the remnant shall be saved. So the figure of sand on the sea is rooted in the promises to the patriarchs, where Abraham looked, whether he looked at the stars in the heaven or whether he looked at the sand on the sea below, he would have a reminder of the number of progeny that would emerge from his loins through the fantastic promise. And even though there were many of them, there was millions of them, and there are millions, and there has been millions, only a remnant among them have made it back to the one whom they were chosen by to represent and witness of and worship and know and understand. This also connects to the 11th chapter, where Paul connects the providence of the falling away of Israel, the apostasy and the rejection of the one who the Gentiles clung right onto, made the right decision, the stumbling block of whom he concludes in the final verse. For he is bringing a matter to an end and is cutting it in short in righteousness, because Yahweh shall cut short a matter of the earth. This is Paul's commentary, I think, on the I actually don't know that. Yeah, it's in quotation, so it may be a continuation of Isaiah. But he who is from the beginning and before the beginning is also the Alpha and the Omega. He is in the beginning, he is at present, and he is future all at once. He experiences the time-space continuum in one instant, thorough and total and permanent knowledge and understanding, one panoramic view. But so he's bringing a matter that he decreed before the foundation of the earth to end. He's summing it in now. This is part of his providential plan, and he's cutting something short for a reason, and it's in righteousness that he does it. The shortness of his cutting is going to make sense. And as Isaiah said before, if Yahweh of hosts have not left a seed, we would have been like Sodom, and we would have been like Gomorrah. This is in the 1st verse, the 9th chapter in the book of Isaiah. And in the 10th verse, he says, take heed, you rulers of Sodom, and then Gomorrah. But Sodom and Gomorrah were, of course, smithereens. They were reduced to ashes ages ago by the time that Isaiah was writing it. So he's likening them to, unflatteringly, to Sodom and Gomorrah, the standards of ancient epicenters of iniquity. This was the worst, most sinful city. Las Vegas on steroids. It was notoriously wicked, Sodom and Gomorrah, and they're the classic case of Old Testament fire and brimstone judgment. They got what they deserved, and Lot was rescued, and his wife looked back because, she was looking back to the sinful lifestyle, and she's frozen to a pillar of salt. What shall we say then? That Gentiles not following after righteousness have obtained righteousness, even the righteousness of faith. The righteousness of faith is that which he speaks of in the 17th verse when he quotes Habakkuk 2:4, the righteous shall live by faith. So even though the Gentiles didn't have the law, they didn't have the worship, they didn't have the biological connection or claim of descent from the patriarchs, they didn't have the culture, they had people like Paul speaking of the one who saved them from their sins, and they grasped onto that belief, and that is why they obtained righteousness, even though they lacked they had no standard of righteousness. They proved their righteousness in reaching out and saving faith to the message that the Jews rejected. But Israel, following after the law of righteousness, has not arrived at the Torah of law of righteousness. So the Torah, or law of righteousness, the law was their measuring rod for righteousness. In the Old Testament measure and standard in assessment and estimation of righteousness would have been on external works, observable things, the following the minutiae of the law, or that's eventually what it degenerated into. It became an almost worship of the law, but it went above and beyond the law. They started adding their own additional addendums and injunctions to make themselves seem more sacred than was, just beyond sacred, but they were just following their own rules. So there was nothing wrong with the law in itself. The law is a perfect specimen, perfect entity. It is a testament and reflection and a concretely communicated revelation of the will of Yahweh. But the problem is that man gets in the way, so the law exists to expose our righteousness. None can be saved by the law except him who honors and obeys it perfectly. That means without a mistake, from birth through life to death. And there's only one person who ever did that. That was the one who was constitutionally capable to procure our propitiation and secure our atonement. The one who was a man, but more than a man. In verse 5 of this chapter. We only got a few more, 32 and 33. Why? Not because of faith, but of works of Torah, for they stumbled at the stone of stumbling. So the answer as to why they could not grasp the righteousness of the Torah was because they eventually faltered and fell, and it wasn't the reason they did not come to the correct confession was not because of works, but it was a failure ultimately of faith. So the works got in the way. They distracted their faith. Their faith was in the workings of the law and their own elaborations and addendums. But they neglected the worship of the one to whom the law pointed to. They were wrapped up. The law was in effect their idol. So even though they were technically monotheists, they were still idolaters, and as proof and testimony of this, they missed the fulfillment of the law when he came to them in their midst, as prophesied in places such as, for instance, Micah 5:2. They should have known these things, but for the stone of stumbling, now he will never be universally acclaimed, but there's coming a day when every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that he is master and Elohim. So you may not bow your knee down today, but there's coming a day when you will. You will be forced to bow your knee, and that day we must stand before him to be reckoned. So he is a stumbling block. He's a source of offense and controversy. And the plain fact is, not everyone's going to like him, nor not everyone's going to like us who are his disciples. And if they hate the master, that means they're going to hate us. So we are, our people having faith is a stumbling block for the faith of the faithless. They just don't understand it, and maybe they slightly envy it, but no two situations and personal responses are exactly alike, and that's something that is known only in the mind of the Almighty. 33rd and final verse. As it has been written, see, I lay in Zion a stone of stumbling and a rock that makes for falling, and everyone who is believing on him shall not be put to shame. This is Isaiah 28, 16 or 12, but Zion is more than the physical mountain. It is the heavenly Jerusalem. So he was heaven sent and heaven bound, and he leads us back to heaven. Yet he also makes people fall because, this is a stumbling. He is a stone, a capital letter stone. He is the cornerstone of the temple and everything else in the center of our lives. But many people fall over this rock, who is more than a mere rock. Rock is indicative of his strength, stability, and just endurance and inexhaustibility. But, some people fall over him. Other people reach out. They make the right decision. They come to him in the right way, and they are richly rewarded. But not everyone. Everyone who believes on him shall not be put to shame. We will not suffer the embarrassment of hellfire or the humiliation of hell. But we will not be ashamed. That means we will be satisfied with having made the correct conclusion. And I hope that's the reason you're here. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.